where do our thinking habits come from? Like, how you think, where does that come from? If you have certain opinions, certain ideas about something, were you necessarily taught them? Or did you develop your own hypotheses about what you think? And that's actually something very useful to think through. How did we develop our own ideas? We're going to spend tonight just investigating into thought, investigating into what determines thought. And so that's why our youth movement is launching serious revolutionary projects internationally. Moses has been around, Rolitza's been around, Jason's been around, you're fairly new. But, you know, there's been a specific curriculum, you could call it. We are considered the university on wheels, where we go from campus to campus and discuss these ideas with people. But in a sense, we are spearheading the intellectual climate in the population that's targeting, you know, young people, because we're discovering that what young people are introduced to in school, that actually all of us have been introduced to, is something that probably has played a large role in why our society functions the way it does, where we've had at this point, more than $450 billion pumped into the system. And so then, you know, you have to think about, well, obviously there's all these projects that are necessary, looking at the bridge that just collapsed, that why couldn't we allocate some of these funds towards developing these types of projects? Why did it have to get to the point where it was so entropic that it just completely disintegrated and we lost human lives for it, or because of it? So I think it can be pretty well known that there are consequences to how we think, and there are benefits. There's obviously something that happens as a result of the manifestation of our thoughts. So we, in this discussion that Lynn had with the leaders of our movement, was discussing this idea of the fact that neither sight nor hearing give you what actually is. Right, and he uses sight and, I keep saying sight and vision, but sight and hearing as the two main senses that basically determine, are the strongest out of our five. And they developed this discussion around how you can't really understand anything through pairwise relationships. That if I was going to tell it, the idea that only your senses would tell you what was happening, that you would just take in this information somewhat like a computer, and then it would process and it would tell it, it would bloop out your other ear, oh, this is what it is, right? This is what your senses are telling you. Take it in your sight, take it in your hearing, and this is what it is. And it's a very literal relationship that occurs. There's no interaction of maybe like what's in between our ears, which is our mind. Where does that come into play? What does that have to do with anything? What does that have to do with our thought? So, from that respect, if you do get caught up in the particulars, like the senses, your feelings, whatnot, your parents are telling you, well, I feel this way, you should do this because I feel like you should do it, or that becomes your own excuse, that you can get stuck in particulars. You can get stuck in a lot of information, but have no idea what's determining the organization of that information, how you think about it as a whole. So it came to the point where they were talking about Kepler and Bach, which seemed to be like the main people that we're developing relationships with. It's Kepler and Bach. And that we're using working through them to train our minds to develop a sense of how to think in terms of dynamics, to think in a dynamic way, to see if we can actually dream in color. Because if you think that only your senses, see, he likes it. So if you're only your senses, if that's what you think, that, you know, whatever you see or hear is what you get, then LaRouche says you dream in black and white. And that's pretty boring. That's a pretty boring conception of this universe that we live in. And so this is, you probably were told maybe by the people that invited you here that this is a development of a music class, or, you know, a presentation on music. And that's definitely part of it. But in order just to understand that, we have to begin to investigate into what is universal. And so, you know, trying to figure out how to develop and explore the senses outside of the domain of your sense perception. Well, how do you do that? All you have is your senses, right? You can see me, you can hear me. Well, how are you determining what I'm saying, and how are you understanding it? We went through this in the last class where Kepler said, well, you have these two opinions. And what Lynn said yesterday to our leaders of our organization was that in order for you to understand what's happening, you develop a new sense faculty, which is what he's called the sixth sense. It's nothing like you see out in the culture, but it is the sixth sense, or a transcendental sense. And so if you're dealing with a physical economy, in order to demonstrate what that sixth sense is understanding, you would develop some physical instrument to measure what that was. But he said in the domain of art, in music, that your mind is the only one that is what actually understands what that is, what that sixth sense is telling you. And once you know it, you know it. And it's as simple as that. Pretty simple. So, I mean, we're engaged in a pretty hefty battle out in our population, the battle of the cultures. Because I don't know if any of you disagree, we don't live in the best of cultures. We live in one that reflects heavy existentialism, heavy self-absorption, heavy, what else? Pessimism. A lot of that is occurring within our culture, and that's what's promoted essentially in the media and what you see around you. So in the context of this, we have, you know, a serious financial blowout that Lynn's been warning about for 35, 40 years on the record, and that he's been right about. Where we are at the point now where there's emergency meetings being called between the Federal Reserve Chairman and senators in the country to try to figure out how to keep people in their homes. How do we keep the housing market and bubble from completely crashing, where we have an escalated exponential growth of foreclosures on homes for people in the United States? And there's also the idea of the war drive, that we do need to impeach Dick Cheney, that's what would give us a real door to be able to begin to solve these problems, or a foot in the door, I should say. So, just in the context of this battle, I'm going to go through. This was shown Saturday, and there's some people that weren't here Saturday. Whoops. Kidding. Okay. This looks familiar, huh? Have you gone to our website before? No? Jason has, right? Darlitza, have you gone to our website? You've gone to our website, Moses. Okay. Can you see this one? Okay. This is not our website. This is our enemy's website. And it basically has literally a good portion of what we have on our own website that's been done through the work over the past, how long has it been? Like a year and a half, 2 years almost of research into heavy physical science ideas. And basically my question is, well, in this context of history, in the middle of a collapsing financial system with our physical economy disintegrating and deteriorating by the day because we've stretched so far from a Franklin Roosevelt style approach that it would be somewhat natural for it to begin to disintegrate, especially 35, 40 years after he's died. But why would anybody care to put any time or effort into doing this? And I bring this question back up because it's important. Because to a majority of our population, a lot of these ideas are really obscure. And if you hung out with us and started reading through the new astronomy or the Harmonies of the world, a lot of it flies by. And a lot of it you're not very familiar with because these ideas just aren't introduced into society. And so, why would anybody care to do this? And so you have there's obviously a serious threat in what we're doing, or it seems like a threat. And the real question is, well, why is that a threat? Because then you're dealing with the question of, well, why is knowing such a threat? Why is you knowing something, having a certain knowledge about something, a threat? So much of a threat that people, and this isn't, like LaRouche says, this isn't some graduate student at MIT. This is a well-funded conglomerate of people, of entities, institutions, that have put a lot of time into this to begin to get you to get a real distortion of a method. Because what's crucial about LaRouche and why he's the best economist in the world is his method of investigation, his method into how you begin to think like a human being, like a real human being, and not take what you see and what you hear as what is. And so it's not really just knowing alone. Knowing isn't a threat. If I knew stuff and I sat in my room all day, I'm not that big of a threat. But we don't really do that. Well, no, we don't really do that. We apply these ideas. We go out into the population. You come across, hey, you want to impeach Dick Cheney? That's probably maybe something you were told when you were met. Either that or, hey, you want to learn how to think? Might have been one of those. But the threat actually comes because once you have a group of young people, like we have in this room, investigating into these ideas and becoming self-conscious of how they think and why they're thinking the way that they think, then you can't be controlled anymore. There's no opportunity to control you, because then you're able to determine, well, wait a minute, based on my reason, what's happening is telling me that this isn't right. Right? If you were to work through the real method of Kepler, guided by the method of LaRouche, you'd be able to understand that there was no work put into this. This was like the Euclid of astronomy, where they plagiarized all of our basically our whole website. even with the animations, and our recommended books. I mean, it's a whole list of Ben Franklin books. So that's the key issue, is this question of how one thinks and how your creativity is a threat to mankind because of what you're going to do with it. How many other people are you going to teach? How many other people are you going to be able to organize and give them an opportunity to understand that their creative reason is really the only thing that they have to offer to mankind for all eternity? That's the only thing you have. You don't have your corporal body. Your spirit doesn't belong in your body, and it doesn't die when you mortally die. So, enough review. Okay. So, we're going to get into some pedagogy here. And I'm going to start, here it is, just by what Lynn taught. This is the mammoth paper that just came out, which is this, I haven't read the whole thing. I've read parts of it, I admit. But the parts that I did read were very pertinent to what we're doing and what we're talking about. But what I want you to begin to think about, and Lynn can speak for himself here, is just this question we've been investigating up to this point, the development of the introduction. So I'll just start this. It says, all competent modern scientific practice, and therefore also all competent economic practice, including making and shaping of economic policies of nations and of the world at large, and even exploration of nearby solar space, depends critically, as Albert Einstein emphasized, on the foundations laid in the connection of the successive discoveries of Kepler and Bernard Riemann. Kepler provides indispensable background for all modern scientific and economic practice. Successful exploration of nearby space would be impossible without his contributions, not only for his particular discoveries, but for his way of thinking. So he's not saying, Kepler's discovery of universal gravitation is the most important thing that you're going to learn about Kepler. That's not what the intent, his intention is not for you to take that from working through the whole, 6-part 1609 New Astronomy. But it's to begin to get at, how does a historical individual like Kepler think? You're not going to just, copy his way of thinking. You just begin to develop a conception of how to think. And Einstein actually says it pretty beautifully in his Essays on Science that has a whole chapter on Johannes Kepler. And he says, in anxious and uncertain times like ours, when it is difficult to find pleasure in humanity in the course of human affairs, it is particularly consoling to think of the serene greatness of a Kepler. Kepler lived in an age in which the reign of law in nature was by no means an accepted certainty. How great must his faith in a uniform law have been to have given him the strength to devote 10 years of hard and patient work to the empirical investigation of the movement of the planets and the mathematical laws of that movement entirely on his own, supported by no one and understood by very few. If we would honor his memory worthily, we must get as clear a picture as we can of his problem and the stages of its solution. And towards the end he says, it seems that the human mind has first to construct forms independently before we can find them in things. Kepler's marvelous achievement is a particularly fine example of the truth that knowledge cannot spring from experience alone, but only from the comparison of the inventions of the intellect with observed fact. So that goes to what we were saying at the beginning of how you determine whether what these senses are telling you. So just a specific idea in the Kepler work. This actually comes from chapter 24, and people can take you through it. It's a chunky chapter. I don't know. Can you off this one? I can't reach it. Hey. So Kepler wants to figure out. That's fine. Thank you. Kepler wants to figure out Earth's orbit and the shape of its orbit. And the paradox that he comes across is, well, how do you figure out Earth's orbit and the shape of Earth's orbit by standing on Earth? That'd be kind of difficult, right? Because you don't really have a sense of what you're doing at all times. You can guess, you can hypothesize. Can I erase this? A lot of work. So he does it through this method of inversion. And we're going to get into, I want to give you an example of an idea of inversion and how we're dealing it with the Kepler, and then how you would understand it in the context of music. And so you have this solitary spinning wonderful sun. It's more like a burst. Earth and Mars. So Kepler thinks that, okay, I want to figure out Earth's orbit. I can't really do it from the standpoint of Earth. So maybe I can do it from the standpoint of Mars. Well, at the time he was around, we didn't really have spaceships. So he couldn't hop on his spaceship in his spacesuit and jump off into space. So this all had to be done in his mind. That's what he had. He had the nighttime sky. He had, years of work that had been done before in terms of observations, and how his mind could figure out what was really happening to what seems like infinitely far away. So I'm trying to think of how. If you were to wait, because every time Mars rotates around the sun, it takes about 687 days, right? So Kepler's thought was that, okay, I'm going to see what happens when Mars comes back to its position after 687 days, to what happens to the position of Earth in that context. And so, how many times would Earth go around the sun? Do you think one?
Under 2 years.
Huh?
Under 2 years.
Under 2 years, right. So you have this observation. This is maybe the first observation. So you're saying it goes a little bit under 2 years, right? So then you would have the Sun-Earth relationship, Earth 1, and the Earth-Mars relationship. And if you did it again, wait till Mars came back another 687 days, Earth would end up somewhere around here, right? Well, something like that. And you can continue to do this. So he uses Mars's orbit around the sun to create two fixed stationary places of observation to really get a sense of Earth's motion and Earth's orbit. This would be a certain idea of inversion, because you always have the Sun-Mars distance as your base. So this is a method called triangulation. And you could figure out from Earth-Mars angle, if you knew this or determined this as a length of, let's say, like 100,000 or something, you could use trigonometry or the law of sines to figure out what this angle would be, and then other distances. So this is a certain idea of a method of inversion. But this was, the beautiful thing is this was done in his mind. He didn't get on Mars and look at Earth every 687 days. You can have a sense of really forecasting and having a method of forecasting and understanding what is to come. So, now, when you're dealing with something like music, you're saying you're taking music lessons right now for the guitar? Okay. Jason, do you read music? No? Okay, this might be a funny shift. Just do it as least haphazardly as possible. But I need all the men on this side. I need all the women on this side. So it would just be easier for all the women to just go over here. Well, yeah. Just do your switches. You just need your, what are those called? I don't know. I don't remember what those are called. So, going back to Mr. Einstein, he has something to say about Kepler's method of inversion, because he was very familiar with it as he worked through it quite extensively. But he says, well, how can you ascertain the real shape of the Earth's orbit? And he calls it a brightly shining lantern at one point. But imagine a brightly shining lantern somewhere in the plane of the orbit. We know that this lantern remains permanently in its place and thus forms a kind of fixed triangulation point for determining the Earth's orbit, a point which the inhabitants of the Earth can take a sight on at any time of the year. And this is just conceptually what we've gone through. And then we've gone through the rest. But I'm going to pass out some of these. Oh, you know what? I made a boo. I forgot to print out the Yezu score. That's okay.
You can project it.
Oh, that's right. From.
It's on a text site.
Can you come grab it while I go through more?
Sure.
Okay, so what we're gonna do, we're gonna sing an inversion. We're gonna sing the relationship of planets. Oh, sorry. Probably got that really weird. So what this is we're gonna be singing from a do ascending to a fa, and then do descending to a fa, which is a certain form of inversion. There's different types and there's different kinds. This is just simply a change in direction. Because you're singing from this do, I think Jonathan Tenenbaum used to give a pretty good idea of why a change in direction in music is not just some literal backwards and forwards, or backwards and forwards, but that if you were walking up a hill, or like if you were walking at the bottom of Homer, and you came up the hill, right? That's a pretty hefty trek. And then once you walk, if you turned around, huh?
I do that every morning.
Every morning. And if you turned around and walked down the hill, it's different, right? You wouldn't know exactly what it was. You could investigate into gravitational theory, but it is different. And so we have to begin to think of directionality in music in somewhat of the same way, not so literal as, some nature metaphor, but that it's different. And why it's different. And inside the context of music, directionality plays a very key role. And we're going to get into some guy that didn't think that was actually true. So I'm just going to have everybody sing. Actually, we can go a little bit. We're going to go from the la, re, and then la. Okay? Everybody do the ascending one first. Ready? And. La, re. Good. Now see if this is different. La, down to a re. Ready? And. La. Did you feel it different?
No.
No?
Oh, yeah.
You just knew it was different. You liked it. Let's do it again. La. Let's do it the other direction. La, re. First. Ready? And. La, re. Do it ascending. La. Registers of our voice, right? Where did we start? Most people started in their first register, and we can get into the idea of register. We can catch you up when Aska and I work with you. But you started in the first register. We descended into onto a re, which was in our first register. But then there was a slight difference. It's a different color because you're using a different region of your vocal apparatus. So that's just fun to play around with. But do you have it?
Music? Yeah.
Yeah.
Hold on 1 second.
This is the first movement of a motet that our youth movement is working on and has been working on for years.
Let's see if you can see it. Is that clear?
Yeah, can you see it? Maybe I can check it later.
Can you zoom in a little bit?
Yeah, we can't see the words. We can see the notes. Kind of.
Well, for the guests, don't worry about the words. You can sing it on whatever you want. We're going to be focusing on, all the women are going to sing the soprano part, the top soprano part, and then all the men are going to be singing the bass part.
Yeah, you think you still zoom in once?
Can you
Like
zoom
a
in at
snap?
Yeah.
Turn it off for a second.
Yeah, we can't see the notes.
Okay, we're going to give them a second. 2 minutes. So, all right. You're trying to zoom it out. Let's sing another inversion. This is from. Actually, no, it's not. Sorry. That's the same one. It's the same fourth fifth. Oh, is that better?
Is that better?
A little bit better. Is that better for the guests? Oh, can you see it better? Yeah? Okay. All right. So, like I said, this is what we're working on. And we're going to focus on the top staff, the soprano, and the bass. And if the women need to stand to get some support, I would understand. Because you're going to need it. So we're going to look at how this principle of inversion applies. Just in the Kepler, we saw it on how Kepler was able to determine Earth's orbit and the shape of Earth's orbit by, quote-unquote, standing on Mars. And this isn't some literal relationship that I'm giving to you. But if you're dealing with universal principles, there would be something universal about the content of what you're working on, of the ideas that you're working on. So, what?
Chris is
Oh, Chris, you really secretly wanted to sing soprano, huh? All the men are on that side, in case you didn't notice.
Strategically planted himself.
So all the guests, just sing it on nay. Now let me hear all the men. Just the first phrase, the first long phrase, all the way to the end of Jesu meine Tzia. Ready? And
Jesu meine Freude, meines Wesens meine, Jesu meine Ziel.
very good. Right here, sit up for that. All right. Yes. Here's somebody return. Ready?
That's for you.
Ready? And very good. Okay, so what I want to do, if you take a look at, we've done this before, but I think in the context of this pedagogical now, with all the work that we've been doing as a youth movement, it's actually changed as an idea. But you can see from the first soprano, Jesu meine Freude, you have a descending line from C, which is a solfege C, to a Mi. Right? Jesu meine Freude. And then the bass starts on the Mi. Jesu meine Freude. Goes back to a Mi. Back, the funny thing is like, well, where did he come from? Back from where? And if you sing these, listen to how it sounds when they're sung together. So I'll just have the first two measures with all the men and all the women. Doesn't it sound like you could have ended with that? There's a certain sound of resolution to it. There was no tension, and where was the development? Why don't we sing it again? A little faster. Ready? And. But you're just starting. I know we're missing two other voices, which could probably add a little bit of a tweak in there. But we're ignoring them for now. And so if you continue on, yeah, right. The ironic thing is that you are just starting something, starting the first of a series of 11 chorales, 11 movement piece in an a cappella motet. But just with those two voices, it sounds like there's already a resolution of an idea. Now, if you take a look at measure 3, this is a measure 3, just the beginning of measure 3, what the soprano does is she starts on her solfege C, which is what she started on here. But now she goes up to her Mi. So let me just hear all the women from the beginning, just up to meines Herzens Wahl. So that's actually an inversion. She goes in the opposite direction of where she started. And instead of, you could have ended it there in a sense. You could have a certain complete idea. One whole rotation from the C to the Mi, back up to the C, and up to the Mi. One full cycle, right? But what does Bach do? He adds this ambiguous D sharp at the end, which gives you an idea, well, it's not really resolved yet. And then you add in, obviously, the context of the words. It makes it a whole different story. And now here you also have the bass, measure 3 and 4, doing the opposite of what the first soprano does in the first two measures. He starts on a Mi and goes up to the C. So Bach is just playing around with this. I mean, the guy was completely rigorous, and he knew that the only way to do anything is through hard work. Anybody that came to him and was like, well, man, Bach, how do you do it? How do you compose these masterpieces and works of art? And he said, just by work. I work at it. And that's what Lynn will tell you. He says almost the same thing. Because he knows it's not something special that exists in any one person. There's obviously a passion driving him. So what's determining what he's passionate about? Is he passionate about his own feelings, his own feeling state, his own sense of security? Or is he passionate about something more profound that would be more productive in society? So there's actually a certain tension that develops here. You add in, the tenor with the fa sharp. We're not going to do that now, but let's just sing up through the first four measures. Everybody. Uncomfortable, maybe a little itchy in your seat. I've never been itchy. So then, Bach is a kind person. He resolves it for you. He breaks out the third register of the females. Actually, no, just of the first soprano. And you have this actually, the mi, re sharp, it comes up in the unter deinem Schirmen, but in the second soprano voice. But you hear this, you already get a sense the soprano resolves it from the top. She breaks into her third and comes down into the resolution. But as appreciants to that resolution, you're already hearing the tenor voice. Da 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 da. I didn't want to hear the tenor singing it. I actually just have that. All the men on the tenor line.
You sure?
Just the Jesu meine Ziel. Can the women start here? Women can start there. Very straight. Oh, I won't. Ready? And Now let me hear it from the beginning, just the soprano and bass all the way through. Don't worry about this. I just wanted you to get a sense of it in your mind physically, because even when you sing the bass part, you'll be hearing the tenor if you're thinking correctly. So let me just hear it from the beginning all the way to the end of that phrase. Ready? And
Jesu meine Freude, meines Herzens Weide, Jesu meine Ziel.
all right. Now, can anybody tell me why the basses shouldn't take a breath there, in between that and this? Who has an idea? Why wouldn't you? You need to breathe, right? Courtney.
Would it be because it's such a small change?
Hmm?
Would it be because it's such a small change?
Small change from what? From C to the Do?
Yeah.
No. Good idea. Nice try. Scott.
I think it would break the tension. It's almost, the breath is almost like a sort of a resolution or a lessening of the tension before you get to that last set part.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's do it. Let's do it two ways. We're going to sing, all the basses are going to sing this. You're going to take a breath. Everybody will take a breath after this, and then sing on. And the second time we're going to sing it, you can take a breath here, take a big breath, and go all the way through to the end of the line. And just see if you notice a difference. Because I honestly can't tell you. I have an idea of why you shouldn't take a breath there. But you are the experiment. And you are in the petri dish. So you have to figure out, in a sense, for yourself. Okay? So we're going to start from the beginning. First time through, take a breath after each phrase. Okay. Let's go a little faster. So, Jesu meine Freude. Ready? And
Jesu meine Freude. Jesu meine Freude, meines Herzens Weide, Jesu meine Ziel.
okay. That was with the breath. Right, it was nice. It was pretty. Try it. Honestly, we can go a little faster. Everyone's a little draggy. Thanks for sitting in your slouches. Everybody can sit up or stand. This time through, you are not going to take a breath here. I don't care if you have to inch it out of your toes. You're not going to take a breath here. Okay? Under any circumstances. So you better figure out how big your breath's going to be before minus Herzens Weide. Ready? And.
Jesu meine Freude, meines Herzens Weide, Jesu meine Ziel.
Which one do you like better?
Second tempo.
Why? Why was that better?
Different idea.
Yeah, no, I'm not necessarily looking for an answer, but you're welcome to. I loved it. That was really great. So, I mean, that's an idea. That's a way to get at because Lynn's going to talk about this discussion around how music can begin to resolve this paradox between vision and hearing. And this is probably the most direct way for us to begin to investigate into it and to discover what this means. I'm going to go on into the piece, into the movement. So just kind of skipping God's Lamb, my bridegroom. Down here, can you see this? Yeah? Most people know it. So then you have another play around inversion. The soprano starts with on a mi, and she inverts what she's done in measures 3 and 4, where she started on a C, went to the mi, and here she's starting on the mi and goes to the C, and finally from there descends into her resolution.
My-hoa.
Yes.
I kind of have a question because I've kind of listened to some of Johann Strauss's stuff, and then Richard Strauss, and then I was listening to Handel's Alleluia from the Messiah,
Mm-hmm.
and then his Passacaglia, and and then I've been also listening to different stuff from Bach. And every time I listen to Bach, I just get really lost. But when I listen to Handel, like I can follow a little bit. I can kind of see like a dialogue between I guess the different voices or like instruments or what I think are different voices. But so I guess I was just gonna ask you well if you know like why exactly like Handel's and these other guys and stuff like these I guess Strauss. I don't know if they're brothers or if they're related, or I guess not. And Handel stuff. If you could kind of give an insight into like some of of Bach's breakthrough, because it seems that not only that if you compare his with other people's stuff, you see a lot of singularity. You don't hear a lot of chords, because at least with Handel and I guess these other composers. You hear a lot of chords but with Bach, there's just so many singularities in every measure. I was really just surprised.
Yeah. I mean, that's what we've been going through. That's what Saturday was. A certain, we're going to get a different little taste of it in a minute. But I do want to give people a sense. Why don't we sing through the whole thing, just from the beginning to all the way to the end. Go to Slam. I liked that time. This time, no breath. No breath. Very good. Very nice. That was fun. Certain idea of give something that we're working on some light. Put it a little bit more. Put a little bit more light into something we're working on. So, this is this is probably something we won't have. People can work on this. This was something I thought would be fun for everybody. It's part of the musical offering from Bach. And it's another, it'll give you another idea of how playful Bach is. Because, why don't we give half to the women? Not for much longer. So, let me give you an idea of, let's go back to where we started from in terms of like why knowledge and the application of knowledge in society is such a threat to, I don't want to call them our enemies, but to the oligarchy, to the empirical, tyrannical beings that be. There's obviously some threat. Hold on. Has anybody heard of Rameau? You ever heard of Rameau? Juan? Jason? Moses? Ralitza? No. This guy was a bastard. Let me say that. He... I think it's 1683 or something. Nobody really cares, but 1683 to 1764. Yeah, he lived longer than Mozart, Beethoven, Bach. The bastards always live longer for some reason. Thank you. So I'll go through this in just a minute. If we have time at the end, we can sing it because it's really, really fun. It's actually a riddle that Bach put out. He put out all these riddles. You know, today we have people that try to figure out really dumb jokes. and Bach's jokes were a little bit more thought-provoking from that standpoint. But Rameau, Jean-Philippe Rameau, he sounds and acts just like his name, wrote this book, Treatise on Harmony. If you ever see this book, run the other way. No, I'm just kidding. Like Lynn says, you should poke at it and see what the hell's inside. It probably won't bite. But this was written in 1722, which is the year... Did you guys already get another handout of the Prelude and Fugue? Did you lose something? Oh. So this was written in 1722, the same year that Bach, this isn't the first book, this is the second book, but developed the Well-Tempered Clavier, or wrote the first book of Well-Tempered Clavier, which was a serious commitment to developing all the potentialities of vocal-based counterpoint. Because I think I mentioned it on Saturday, Werkmeister, who was really well known to Bach, and certain contemporary, where Bach knew all of his essays on counterpoint. And he was actually the one that introduced, Werkmeister had said that Kepler was the best musician known to man.
Kepler?
Mm-hmm. And his works on counterpoint were extremely well known. Werkmeister's works on counterpoint were extremely well known to Bach, and that's what Bach had studied. So you have this relationship between, obviously, the science and the music, but the interrelationship between these ideas. Okay. I guess we can hear it. All right. We can hear the Prelude and Fugue from Book 2. I think you should have all of it. But this will give you a sense. This Book 2, this is written like 20 years after his first book. But you'll start to get a sense. I have another treat on Rameau in a minute. But this just gives you a better sense of how Bach thinks. All right. So this is a C minor prelude and fugue from book 2. Oh, sorry. That's actually, I like that one particularly because Mozart. No. Is this set up?
The speaker? Yeah, it's plugged in. Yeah, it's on.
Okay. I particularly like this one and chose it yesterday because it's just another example of how this dialogue across generations occurred because Mozart, after he was introduced to Bach in 1782 or so, it just revolutionized his method of composition, and he fell in love with Bach and took these preludes and fugues, a few of them, I think about 5 of them, and transcribed them for quartets. And they're not literally exactly the same, but it's pretty damn close. Oh, I don't hear anything. Am I supposed to turn something?
Is your computer muted?
Sorry.
Ah.
Let's do it again. Okay. Take 2. That's a nice little homage to Bach. So who were we? Oh, we were talking about Rameau. And I mean, this treatise, what struck me, it's not really a treatise, it's like I don't know what the hell it is, it's long. But it's written and set up almost exactly like the Harmonies of the World, where he goes through, the sections are set up like it goes through harmony, he goes through proportion, he goes through consonance, he goes through dissonance.
The book?
Yeah. But that was written as an attack on what Bach was doing. The same year that he comes out with the Well-Tempered Clavier, he's got this treatise. And, I mean, it might be Voltaire really promoted Rameau publicly. And the very first sentence of this work is pretty revealing from the standpoint of how he thinks. He just kind of put it out there. But he says, music is the science of sounds. Therefore, sound is the principal subject of music. So if you contrast that with what Lynn's talking about around this question of vision and hearing, nowhere in our literature will you say hear Lynn say, the same thing. They're completely opposite in terms of their character of thought. And so I thought it would be kind of fun if we're actually going to look at the Jesu from the standpoint of Rameau. So you can kind of get into his mind a little bit. I won't do it too much because I don't want you to leave freaked out.
If you want the bigger one, go to the Microsoft PowerPoint.
So Microsoft, okay.
Just hit F5.
Oh, My-hoa.
Yeah.
There was a political fight also between like classical music and non-classical music, because I guess when Wagner was alive and Kurt Wong or whatever Wagner was like a conductor, Wagner was actually put in because he was like in favor of tuning of A440, and he was in 4C256. And then Galileo Galilei's father was also like a musician, and he was against this other guy by the name of Zarlino, who was known as like, I guess, in support of tuning in C256 and some other stuff. So there has been a political fight between, like some like factions that promote the idea of like music that's lawful and inspires people.
So how Rameau would see this chorale is, since music is the science of sounds, he actually thinks vertically. He would actually think in terms of vertical harmony. And the biggest thing with Rameau is the fundamental bass. Is that whatever I guess you could call it key, right? If you're in C or E or D flat major, F, anything, any configuration of those notes, the rule, I guess you'd call it the rule, is that the fundamental bass or the root of the chord would always be a part of your harmony. And from that standpoint, you could analyze it. And so he actually thinks in terms of a sequence of individual effects. And so, just as an example, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Just this. If you took just the first note of all 4 voices, you have a do, mi, sol, mi, right? Am I right?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. It's just in different. So what Rameau would consider, he would say this was a perfect C consonant. But it's only true if you're only looking at these 4 notes in relationship to each other in and of themselves, in isolation. You've isolated this, you've plucked it out, and you're looking at it like this thing, and you're saying that is a perfect C consonant. And you
like this the perfect set of notes from the C major scale.
Yeah. Right. And so you could also say that about this. That would be what? Let me see. A B natural consonant. So if he's looking at these, and I mean I've had to do this in a different form, not in Rameau, where you would sit and analyze chords and chord progressions and get a sense of what those are, which is really, I always failed. Now I'm happy that I actually failed and always had problems with it. But he would look at these in isolation, this in isolation and this in isolation. No idea of a progression of where it's come from, how it's developed. And if you play it in succession, what was it, the B and the C? Oops, I'll just do one hand. kind of nonsensical. That's how Rameau thinks. That's the world he dreams in. That's the color that he dreams in, which is this. It's kind of scary. Right. But if you think about it in the context of the chorale, what we worked on at the beginning, where, I think it was Scott that had mentioned, if you do take a breath at the end of this Vida, you actually break a certain tension that's developing on this, what Rameau would call a consonant C chord. So this tension has developed out of a process of transformations. And according to Rameau, he would just think it was just a process of a succession of sound effects, of chords. And sometimes we sing it like that, right? Sometimes it is somewhat chordal and vertical, but that's what we're working on. So, all the voices of Bach's chorale, they have their own willful motion. You can take it in and of itself. Like if I just played one voice. Which voice do you guys want me to play?
Alto.
Alto? Huh?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is just one voice from the fugue. That's one individual voice from the fugue. We would just give you an idea. That was to just give you an idea of how, even just within one voice, there's a motion. Not once are you just like, okay, you can see a lot of the riffs in today's music. There's a lot of repeated notes, and you can sing in the Ave, the tenor line. You have a lot of repeated laws, but it is going somewhere. So every moment within the context of a piece, of a polyphonic piece like this, it can be considered a real historical moment, because you have the intersection and interacting of all these voices and these relationships. They're like relationships to relationships. And so, with somebody like Rameau, how do I?
Hit
Oh.
escape and hit the
Okay.
minimize it.
I wasn't going to do this, but you should probably hear it. Whoops. Okay, so this is just a this is a clip. I haven't watched the whole thing, but basically, you know, going towards this idea of process of transformation. If you were to listen to a Bach fugue or a if you were to listen to that's Einstein playing the violin, a Bach fugue, and start it and then stop it and then start it in the middle, you wouldn't know what the hell was going on because you missed a whole process of transformation. That's the principle of real creative thought, that it's ever changing. It's always changing. It's never the same. And so, what I want you to hear, I'll just play a little bit of it for you. And we're going to do this stop-start with Rameau. This is a piece by Rameau. So,
Oh, God.
Are they monks?
You made it full screen right in the bottom right.
hold on. That one?
No, the other, yeah, that one.
They're speaking French. Huh? Turn it up. I don't really know why they're wearing that. They're French, you know, I don't know. Okay, we're in the middle. I don't hear any tuning. Okay. 3 minutes later. In the same mode. Oh my god. 4 minutes. Oh my god, it's almost the end.
Man.
It did work. That's what you call crazy. So that Rameau's way of thinking really isn't a threat. If anything, he was scared crapless of what Bach was doing. Since he was, you know, Bach actually at the time he was alive wasn't so famous. His works weren't so famous, even until after he died. But he knew, he actually deployed his 3 sons in different places because he knew the power of what he was doing. And so he deployed his 3 sons into 3 different courts because he had a sense that they would be killed if they were all together. And having a consciousness of what that power is and how we're able to develop that within the youth movement, within our own abilities to think. Because us sitting in this room could be a really big threat. We are a really big threat, and we should continue to be so at a much higher, intense level. So, I'm pretty much, that's what I have to say. I mean, I think the real idea is to think and not learn. I'm going to take that as Lynn's advice from today, or from yesterday. I said, think. You must think. You can't learn. There's nothing productive about just learning. So, that's what I have. Do people have any questions?
Because you have these things, right, this up and down part, but there's also, like, the part that's diagonal in the music.
The cross voice?
Right. Not just that, but there's also, like descending lines within the, because you have the, all the singing is together, right? And then after that, they do a polyphonic, or, you know what I mean, like they're singing different melodies, and they come together. I just have a question of how Bach would kind of compose, kind of, not, I don't want to think of it as like being in between the verticals, but like how did it, because it's all one thing, but how did he do that?
How do you figure out the intervals?
Not the intervals, but like
The relationships?
right in between. Right, like for example, if you put up the Jesu meine Freude, you have the initial statement, or this the initial notes that you're singing, and then Weide is a different series of notes that you're singing. Right, and then so how did he go from one to the other? That's my question. How did he compose that like that?
Well, I mean, I think the best way to get a sense of it is just work through a lot more Bach.
Because I could play like the notes and then the next set of notes, right? But I don't know how to think about what's in between those things. That's like
That's
the
what we're working
typical
on in the
music
chorus.
student, you know what I mean? Like starting from the chords and filling in.
Yeah, well, part of the best way is through the chorus. That's what we're working on, or that's my intention is in the chorus. That example that the bassist did towards the end is part of an example of how you get a sense of this in-betweenness. Because it's not just literal blocks of sequences, but how do you develop and preserve the motion of the idea? Because ideas should, in terms of ever-changing ideas, should always be in motion. But you discover from Kepler it's not really a uniform motion, that it's ever-changing. So, yeah.
Well, I was just thinking about Scott's question. That one thing is she demonstrated one way, which was he took the beginning phrase that he started with, the da 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 da, and then he just inverted it to get the next measure almost. So you arrive at the same. You arrive at this back at the same starting note. I think.
He ends up on a
different direction.
Mi. Right, he starts on a C, descends to a Mi, starts on that same C, and ascends to a Mi. Or a Ray sharp. I was just thinking to the Mi.
Yeah. Okay. So one thing right there is just that the second measure, it's related to what he first he puts something out there for your mind, and then he relates what he does in the second measure to what he's already put out there. So just is that the question of the relationship between them, that they're not like, I love the point that you made, which is that they're not arbitrary, but Okay, you have one thing. Now we're going to invert it and see what happens. You hear the same, the same intervals in a different direction.
Mm-hmm.
He does that with time a lot too. Of rhythm.
I have a question. You were talking about with the beginning part of the motet, where you're saying, because I understand it sounds good when you're not adding that breath in where it goes, but wouldn't that actually be originally destroying the idea? Because there would be a reason why Bach would put the comment in there for you to actually take a breath, right?
Mm-mm. He didn't write it in there for you to take a breath. Those breath marks, those commas aren't literal breath marks. In terms of the poetry, they are where you can take a breath. But to preserve the idea, I don't know if you heard the second time. I mean, did you like the second time better?
I mean, I liked it without the breath.
Mm-hmm.
It does sound much better because, like, up it'll be give your side and you pop instead of da 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 da.
Yeah, it might. It sounded. I don't disagree. It sounded nice,
Okay.
but there was no tension.
Mm-hmm.
There was no. Remember, like the tension towards that consonant C. If we would have stopped on that B natural consonant, which is on the Vida, and then started on the C, there's no already the person that's listening to has already stopped thinking. They've kind of just like relaxed and gone, oh, they're just starting another phrase. Because you always have to think of it from the standpoint of communicating something. You don't want to just sound nice. When you're organizing somebody, you don't want to just like sound nice. You want to give them some paradox. You want to give them some tension. You want to give them an idea of like, okay, well, let's get some, intensity going here. Let's figure out how you think, and let's play around with how you think, and play around with how we can change that. So that's a real key part. I don't disagree. It sounded nice, but that's not what we're looking for.
Question on the well-tempered clavier.
Yeah.
And there's, I have a bunch of questions, but I guess the most basic one, his structure, prelude and fugue, all the way through. And I have my vague kind of ideas around his intention, the deliberation of how he might have thought about this sequence. But I just wonder what you think about this.
About like the structure of the prelude and fugue? I'm not too sure about the structure of the prelude and fugue. I do know more about like the English suites and the French suites, that they were set up as studies in rhythm. There were specific studies on rhythm because at the time, because you can tell, the suites are all a lot of dances, French dances, gavotte, jig, sarabande, allemande, and they're all set in these short suites, but they're all a different study of a different rhythm. The prelude and fugue, honestly, what I do know about it is that it's breaking the boundary of like this vocal-based counterpoint, vocal-based polyphony, because you just had a breakthrough, with Werkmeister having a sense of Kepler, or thinking that Kepler is the most profound musician ever known to man, whose work on counterpoint is then taught to Johann Sebastian Bach. And so, in terms of the structure, I don't know why exactly it's written the way it is, in terms of like the prelude and then the fugue.
Fugue seems to have a general intention of kind of investigating the voices, but keeping the themes, even though you can move from major, minor, change the keys, you can do a whole bunch of things. The theme's there, you can hear it.
But it's always changed.
Yeah. But that's always introduced by the prelude.
Right.
Something else.
I don't know. I'd like to investigate. If you find out, come tell me.
One more question. Second book?
Yeah.
I'm wondering what made him go back to this thing after 20 years?
Yeah, 20 years. I don't know. It's in the Forkel biography.
Oh.
Have you read that?
Heart's good, actually.
It's like it's the best biography of Bach. It's the best. Goes through Bach's idea of harmony, but it's Forkel actually interviews C.P.E. Bach and Wilhelm Friedman, which are Bach had three sons that basically took on Bach's music work in terms of method seriously than his like 20 other sons. But they did the interview, and it's ultimately from Bach's family how this biography is written. So you get a real sense of who he is, what kind of person he is. But he actually goes through it in there. I don't know if he goes through why it was written 20 years later. Harley might know. A bunch of people might know. Just on this riddle. I messed up the last line. I forgot to. I don't know. I must have been busy or something. But I forgot to put in the marks for the notes on the very last line. But the riddle is that you can sing this thing. Obviously, normally people would start from the upper left-hand corner and go all the way through, right? Well, the riddle is that you can have one person starting at the beginning and the other person starting at the end and going backwards. So we're going to do this in chorus.
Cool.
So, it's called the crab cannon. So I think we can break off into discussion now. Bueno.